Hey everybody, how you doing? My name is Dave Block. I'm part of Crosswinds Church and work with Plant 616. I'm so happy you're all here. I'm not going to take much time because most of you have heard what Plant 616 is about, but I'm just going to give a little bit of that story. So it came about from a conversation between Chris at Elevation, which is now Buck Creek, and Crosswinds Church, Dave Drake and myself. Our experiences with church planting in the city, and we realized some of the playbooks didn't always work the same way as it did in the summer. And so we're wrestling with that. And so we're like, okay, we want to see more thinking around how to do this better. And then as we kept going, we started having conversations with other people. And they're saying, we're having the same experiences. And then we talked to one guy who quit his job at a denominational level, went and figured out how to do planting in the city with like 6 planters at the same time. And what he discovered in the process was the culture was shifting. That what he was learning how to do in the urban setting was going to be important for the entire culture. Let's see. So this is what we've noticed. So the church typically, this scale represents a missiological scale. If you've taken some missiology, the further you get down to M4, that's a ton of cultural distance, different language, hostility towards the gospel. And in the American church, our strategies are generally camped out in the 0 to 1 range. That we're in this space, our strategies are designed to reach those people that are near to the church already, and which has worked for quite a while. You can start up, there's a ton of people culturally near, but that pool is shrinking. And I've been doing trainings at the seminary, walking seminaries. I'm like, what do you feel is going on in the past 6 years? And they just feel this drastic shift where we didn't move, but it felt like the culture did, that it moves further down that scale. So our passion is to see the church through church plants, micro churches, through established churches, thinking creatively, how do we reach outside of our bubble and reach into the cracks and crevices of the city? That's been our heartbeat. It started out, we just want to plant churches, but we think it's a multi-level strategy that needs to happen. That if you're an established church, you have a role. One of our friends, he was going to be here today, he didn't make it. He helped his church say, hey, we've been really inward looking and we want to look outwardly. So they went through this process and basically they landed on, we need to do something. And they said, let's identify, are there any unreached people groups in West Michigan? And they identified the Bosnian community. And he collaborated with a number of churches saying, we're going to go plant a church amongst the Bosnian people. That was just because one church said, we need to look outward. We need to find some crack and crevice to reach into and be present there. So we'd love to see more about that. So we see ourselves as conversation starters. And we've only been going a year and a half, but we keep running into people saying, we're thinking about the same thing. How can you help us take steps? We've had meetings where people share stories and then someone else walks up and goes, I've been praying for that same exact thing. So it's been fantastic. So we're like, how do we reach further? Because the culture is moving further. It's more hostile. It's not as open. How do we do that? And so we have 3 things we want to do. We want to collaborate. We think we're better together. Like, you get a bunch of people. Jesus prayed that we would be unified. And so we don't want a false unity. We don't want a unity that erases our distinctives. But when we've been gathering monthly, we have, we have some a Presbyterian street preacher showing up. We got a former Baptist turned charismatic showing up. You have missionary, you have nonprofit leaders, you have suburban church leaders, you have micro church leaders. You have all these people in a room. And what we've discovered is we have a whole lot more in common than we do have differences. That, and actually, we benefit in spiritual health from hearing from each other. It stretches us it pulls us. We don't always agree, but we don't want to collaborate just for the sake of unity. We want to collaborate for the sake of mission. So what we want to see is cultivation. We want to cultivate. We want to see multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches. Tony's here with Set Network, and they've partnered with us through this event and other things, and we're so grateful for them. We hear about multiplication all the time. It's not always being talked about in a lot of church circles I'm stepping into. So our passion is saying, let's start thinking more about how we can multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. And what happens when churches from various networks connect is we can make movement happen. Like the keys are not only just how our networks are doing, it's all those spaces in between. So we're passionate about that. And then the aim of all of it is we want to saturate. We like to say we want to reach into every crack and crevice of the city, which means there might be large churches, might be small churches, whatever the mission mandates, that's what we'd like to see. And we'd like to encourage churches to do that. So we got a few things coming up. First of all, we have our monthly forums. Our next one is on December 12th. You can find out about all these things on our Facebook and sign up for email updates at our website. We have a couple other things that are starting up. We have our leadership coaching cohort. Basically, we discovered that a lot of the pastors in these neighborhoods, they don't necessarily need more content. What they need is a space to slow down, be heard, and take those next steps. I was recently through a coaching cohort, and I'm like, I could have used this like 6 years ago. So we're going to set up a space, and I realized how impactful it was to just have a time to stop, not have someone else tell me what to do, but to go, we believe in you, let's unpack what your next step. So we're building this leadership coaching cohort. We're doing a Discovery Bible Study learning cohort. Discovery Bible Study is a missionary tool that's used around the globe to spark disciple-making movements. We've been using it in our context, and we think that's a great way for us to start a learning environment that will actually lead to action. The goal of this is that you would actually start an evangelistic Bible study with someone in your network. So if you know someone from your church that's like, they're evangelistic, they're ready to take that next step, we'd like to do that in community and move through that process. Like I said, there's more to come, there's more things in the works. And that's just to give you an idea of our schedule. Daniel, who I'll introduce in just a moment, is going to be sharing about some trends. And then we'll have some Q&A. We're looking forward to having a great conversation. Then we'll take a break. We have coffee over there. We have water. We have fruit and some trail mix. So feel free to get some of that. And then we're going to come back and we'll have a facilitated conversation around collaboration and what that might look like. I think that's it. Am I missing anything? So one of the things that really got our juices flowing was going to the think tank at the Church Multiplication Institute last year. And Daniel's the director of Church Multiplication Institute, had a bunch of voices in the room around citywide networks and the possibilities of collaboration in a region. And just reading the books, listening to that content, really got our fire going. And so we're like, okay, how do we bring some of that conversation to us? So this really got us going. So Daniel's the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, leading and overseeing all of its initiatives. Prior to directing the Institute, he planted a church in Toronto, where he also helped recruit, assess, and train church planners through the Set Network and the Release Initiative. Daniel has also served on various staffs, including Northwood Church, led by Bob Roberts Jr., where he was trained as a church planner and involved in global and multi-faith engagement. Prior to church planning, Daniel was an engineer for 8 years. He earned an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, a BS in Computer Science from U of M. and is currently a PhD in Intercultural Studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's also the co-author of Inalienable, How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church, which I recommend. And we're just happy to have you at this conference today and to join with us. So I'm going to pray and then invite you up here. Our Father, you are good to us. So good. Things get disrupted, things get hard, but you're present with us in the midst of it. And even though it seems like we have some trying times ahead of us, we know you're going to be with us, you're going to lead us through it, that there's untold potential because you accomplish more than we ask or think. And so we're asking for you to work in us and through us, and that we would see the sparks of collaboration fly, and you only know what can come from there. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me. Well, good morning, friends. I'm really excited and eager to be with you guys. Is the mic on? Let's see. Oop, I got it off. Here we go. And I just want to say thanks to Dave and Chris for extending this invitation and bringing me up. Really have been looking forward to this time. If I sound a little bit nasally, I'm kind of overcoming that RSV that's kind of going around, and my family's in the thick of it. I don't think I'm not viral because I'm going on week 3. So, but if you hear nasally or sniffing and stuff like that, it's me recovering. A couple of things that I want to take us through is, as Dave mentioned, I want to take us through some trends, and so it's going to be a really big picture. So this morning, we're going to have to put on like our missiology hats, and so that's going to be what you're going to be thinking through with me is some national trends, things that may immediately not feel like it's going to affect like your local work of discipling people and developing leaders in your church. But what I want to do is help kind of create a context for what I think what you're already feeling, but also probably what we're going to be feeling even more over the next 10 to 20 years. And so a lot of the things that we'll talk about will have a direct effect on how your leaders will lead the church moving forward over the next few decades. And then we'll, at the back end of our time, we'll talk about like how to develop city collaboration and what does that look like. My work at the Church Multiplication Institute, I office out of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. Work with a guy named Ed Stetzer, and the work that we do predominantly is to help network leaders and denominational leaders think better about how to lead their church planting organizations, and specifically as we're thinking about the future. And so not just how to better your system, so how to do assessments and coaching and training better, although that's important, but what are the things that like we're not thinking about that are going to eventually, sometimes, overhaul our systems, but at the very least help us to think about not just best practices, but how do we do things like in a way that's innovative. But if you think about it, best practices is actually a term that we use to kind of like optimize what we're currently doing. And if you're only thinking about best practices, you just get better at what you're currently doing. And if you do something really, really, really well and excellently, over time that becomes a tradition in itself. And so best practices are really important for getting better at what you're doing. But the reality is that, based on that chart that you were showing us, Dave, if we're only really good at what we know what we're good at, what that eventually does is it actually isolates the people that we're not good at reaching. And so what we try to do at the Church Multiplication is to try to stimulate the thinking, to help us think about like how do we not just do best practices, but how do we actually think outside of our systems and our processes. I also curate a group called the Chicagoland Church Planting Alliance, which is a network of networks. And so a lot of the work that I do in collaboration is to help city leaders and network leaders think better about coming into rooms like this, not just for content, but for relationship, and then over time, shared mission. And we were just sharing over dinner last night that a lot of the work that you all are starting to do through Plant 616 and some of the other initiatives that you're a part of goes at the speed of relationships. So it involves several iterations of rooms like this and lunches and meeting in each other's spaces, and over time you develop a heart for each other and you care about one another's work, and it really is going to be birthed out of like the care that you have for one another that develops the collaboration that's necessary to reach your cities. So I want to share a little bit. I mean, I'm not a dynamic presenter, so I know that like the best part of me is my family. So usually this picture wins people's hearts more than my content. This is my wife, Linda, and my kids. We've been married since we were 19, so we've been married 23 years. And that's my oldest son, Justin's in the back. He's 21 now. Connor's on my left over here. Joe's our third. And then Abe is our fourth. And we finally got a little girl, Sarah. She runs the house. And so I grew up in Detroit. So this is actually a picture of me at the age of some of my kids. Anybody, I mean, I know Tony, you guys are from the Metro Detroit area. Anybody ever lived in Metro Detroit? I know, Tim, you're in Livonia. Anybody else? So I grew up on the east side of Detroit, 7 Mile in Gratiot. And so if you Google my zip code that I grew up in, 48205, there's documentaries of how difficult that zip code, at one point, I think in 2007, it was the most violent zip code in the United States. And so that was my upbringing. This is probably, let's see, based on my haircut, 1993-ish or so. So I might have been 14 or 15. I was not, you notice my friend's got a starter jacket. That used to be a thing. Does anybody remember starter jackets? I'm kind of showing my age now, right? So but in this room, I feel like, you guys understand this stuff. And then my other friend, Josh, he has a pro player, which was like, you couldn't afford a starter jacket, so you bought a pro player. I was the poorest out of the three, so I just borrowed somebody's hoodie. And so this is us in Detroit. Ethnically, I'm Hmong, and so you may not be familiar with the Hmong people, but there was actually a movie made about the Hmong people in Detroit. Does anybody know the movie? So Gran Torino. You guys seen this movie with Clint Eastwood? Yeah. So Clint Eastwood came into Detroit 2000. So the recession hit 2008, and so the governor at the time, I'm trying to remember who the governor was at the time. So they gave a bunch of tax breaks to the state of Michigan for movie companies to come in. And so RoboCop was made here during that time. Transformers 3, a couple of different movies. So Clint Eastwood came in. He made this movie, and it's a really interesting movie because in some ways it's also a parable of how we think about like race and ethnicity. I'm not going to predominantly talk about race and ethnicity, but I think it's a good start. This is a really great parable about how predominantly those who aren't Jesus followers paints the narrative of how we talk about race and ethnicity in America. And so has anybody not seen the movie? Okay, I'm totally going to ruin it for you today, so that's okay. The movie's about a guy named Walt Kowalski. I think it was actually filmed in Highland Park, which is a little square mile island inside Detroit. So it's a separate municipality, but it's inside Detroit. And so Walt Kowalski is a Korean War vet, and so he kind of represents white America. And but the neighborhood's completely changed all around him. And African Americans have, at this point, obviously, the Great Migration's happened, and so African Americans predominantly are now, Detroit, if I remember correctly, it's 83% African American. It could be higher than that. My high school was much higher than that. It was probably 95%. And but according to the movie, so African Americans, they essentially run the block, but they don't own the block, but they run the block. And then here's an influx of immigrants. And so this particular movie focused on the Hmong immigrants that came in. Now, Hmong people, we came to the United States as refugees in 1979. So my parents came from Laos. So most of the Hmong people that are here in North America came from Laos. My family landed in Illinois. We moved to Detroit when I was 8 or 9. And according to the movie, which was my experience, during the late 80s and 90s, there was a lot of gang activity. And so a lot of the Hmong folks developed their own gangs, and part of it was to find social belonging in a sense, community, but it was also a way in which you competed and thrived in the inner city as an immigrant, specifically a refugee. And so the movie goes on, and so there's a lot of gang dynamics, and if you, for those of you who saw the movie, if you remember what happens at the end, does anybody, you remember what happened at the end? So in order to kind of solve the conflict, right? So Walt Kowalski or Clint Eastwood, he has to essentially sacrifice himself, and he dies essentially the hero, right? And this is such an interesting analysis on race and ethnicity in North America, because what this movie says is that and some of it is probably observationally true to a certain degree, but there's a lot of complexity, right? So the movie tries to tell us that at some point whites used to kind of own and live in the spaces, and then African Americans are assimilating, but they don't quite own, and then here come immigrants, and so there's this whole dynamics, and in order for there to be some level of peace, whites have to die, right? But in dying you become the hero, and so that's the story of race and ethnicity in America, told by Hollywood and some of our social sociology books. But that's not the gospel, right? The gospel doesn't the gospel in some ways reminds us that Jesus dies, so none of us have to die. But because Jesus dies, in a sense, we all also have to die. And so there is an exaltation that we get with Jesus, but also with Jesus, there's a giving of ourselves, becoming all things to all people, so that we might see some saved. And that's worth noting, that I think when we talk about what does it mean to reach people in our neighborhoods, especially if you have a place-based ministry, incarnational, missional for a long time in North America, also had this dimension of incarnational ministry. If you are becoming all things to all people, there is a sense in which you should have an exaltation of your identity. There's a redefining of who you are in Christ. But along with that redefining is also this kind of laying down of power, laying down of your personal preferences. And so I shared my story with you because I think it's important for us. Part of it is for me to make an emotional connection. Now, Michigan is, in a sense, home for me. I went to University of Michigan, go blue. We're pretty far west out here, so I don't know. Good, because I know other people tend to cheer for this other team that's, geographically closer here. But a part of this is I can only minister out of who I am. This is my story, right? I'm a 42-year-old man. And so this forms so much the missional narrative in my head. And so I don't have the same narratives that some of you have. We're in Grand Rapids, the Jerusalem of, what did they say? The Jerusalem of America. And so I don't have that same heritage that we have here in Grand Rapids. Mine's very different than some of you are fourth, fifth generation, especially if you're Dutch American. But it's important for us to celebrate our heritage and our missional narrative. So, yeah, I saw Mr. Rogers do this exercise one time. I don't know if it's going to work, but I thought it was cool when he did it. I think he was accepting an Emmy, and he did this in true Mr. Rogers fashion. He went up to do his acceptance speech, and he says, "I'd like for us all to take 15 seconds to remember somebody in our lives that got us to the point where we're at today." So a little bit different from his exercise. What I'd like for you to do is I want you to take a minute, and I want you to appreciate your own story. What is it about your own story that you appreciate? What is it that you want to celebrate about your heritage, your upbringing? There's a lot of us that we went through, family, trauma, those kinds of things. But what is it that you appreciate? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, and then I'll stop you and I'll let you share briefly with a partner or with somebody next to you, and then we'll move forward after that, okay? I'm also going to invite Jesus to lead us in this. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for helping us to engage all parts of ourselves. In this time, we ask that you engage our heart and help us to recall the things that you used in our lives to get us to this point. All right. Hey, I'm curious. I'd love to, with permission from your partner, I love to hear, like, what did you learn about your partner? Maybe hear from 2 or 3 people. Just anything that you want to celebrate from your partner sharing. I mean, you can share your own, but I feel like, Tony, you want to?
Yeah, obviously I got to talk to Chris, and Chris, his spiritual background was United Methodist, dad, a Catholic mom, and he goes, you know what, he said, if I was counseling my own friends or children, I wouldn't have ever counseled that to, like, bring you to Jesus, but it did in him.
Yeah.
So it just shows you the handiwork and the providence of God to weave in, despite all the things around us. And here we are now sitting, Chris opened it today with that anticipation that we're setting on the threshold of the next big thing that God wants to do.
Yeah.
And so he's like, there's my origin, here's where I live every day, just anticipating something
Yeah.
amazing by God. So I appreciate his enthusiasm for the Lord.
That's awesome. Thanks, Tony and Chris. 1 or 2 other stories. Like, this is helpful to me. Right up here.
Sure. So we had a commonality of discussing how God has always, especially from eternity past, chosen to keep a remnant in families and in our past of unbelief,
Yeah.
and of trial and tribulation, and then we kind of ended with thinking about Paul. I think it's in 1 Corinthians, who says, both in your comfort and your suffering, that we're going through these things so that we would trust in God who raises the dead.
Yeah.
And
right.
so
Yeah.
while he had opposition right in the church to disprove his authenticity of being a Christian by saying that because he was, he wasn't wealthy and his travel plans got canceled and he wasn't dependable, and look at his past, they use these things to try to say that he wasn't a genuine believer. But Paul actually pointed to those things to prove the authenticity that Christ was with him, and that he wasn't, although Christ was with him in the past and in the present, he wasn't focused on those things. He was looking forward to God who raises the dead. So
Yeah.
we rejoiced in the undercover remnant of God that he had chosen
Yeah.
to reach to us, so that we would come to genuine repentance and faith,
Yeah.
and now rejoicing
Yeah.
that we're Christians, maybe.
Yeah.
God
That's
is
really cool. Yeah. Be able to trace that thread in your own lineage is huge. Yeah.
We think about the Latin phrase is Felix Culpa,
Mhm.
beautiful fall.
Yeah. Really good. Maybe one more. Love to hear one more.
It's cool talking to JT, just get his story. We have such different backgrounds. Like just growing, he's like, man, God can save anybody. Just growing up, dad, bailed out on the family, growing up single parent home, kicked out of the house at 15, running the streets, and like just a trophy of God's grace in his life. It's just super cool. Not my story at all.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just like awesome that we're sitting in this room together,
Yeah.
from just totally different backgrounds, and God has
Yeah.
weaved these stories of redemption together, and it's beautiful
Yeah.
tapestry and testimony.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Mike and JT. Yeah. So I think it's important to keep in mind as we're going to move forward this morning, because I'm going to give you a bunch of huge, big themes. But these themes all connect to stories and connects to the development of the future leaders and future believers that will be one day hopefully sitting in similar spaces that you are. That what you're a part of, what we're a part of, there's continuity, there's heritage, there is a continuum. And so there's sometimes where we feel like we're discovering something new for the first time, but you realize that you're solving a problem that many generations before you had been actively working on as well. This is just kind of your generation's version of that. And so, but out of the complexity and also sometimes the mystery of it all, was sometimes, you mentioned Paul, Ephesians 3, Paul calls it's the mystery, he says it's the church, the administration of the church. The problem that we get to be a part of, or we get to be a part of solving, this is deeply tied to who we are in your own stories. That's why Paul says in Acts chapter 17 that God appoints, certain times for nations to be in the places that they are, that they might reach out to him. And so we're going to jump into some national trends And as we're thinking about national trends, you can begin to make the connections and how does this actually begin to take root at the grassroots level, especially when you're thinking about those who have been a part of the church for a long time, some of us who grew up probably 7th, 8th generation Christians, and then those, like my family, my dad was a first generation Christian, a Christian in the lineage of our history. How do these stories begin to trickle down from the national narratives? So there's a passage that I like to use here, just as we talk about trends in the future. I'm reminded of this question that Jesus was asked. Lord, at this time are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you'll receive the power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. I love this question because the disciples, the apostles in a sense, are saying, so when is all this stuff going to happen? When is this going to culminate? And Jesus says, can't tell you, just keep following the Holy Spirit. So just remember, everything I'm telling you today, I'm not solving any problems for us. Just keep following the Holy Spirit, all right? But some of the stuff that we're talking about, I'm hoping will give you a better context. Now, really big picture. Think about this. This is the projected growth of Christianity by continent. It's from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. If you look at the first couple of decades in the 20th century, now Africa's the green line, Asia's purple. I want you to pay attention primarily to North America and Africa. We got Brother Sepa from the Congo over here. North America is the dark orange line, and let me see if I get my beam's not working. But you can see it over here. In the the beginning of the 20th century, North America is by and large emerging as one of the population centers for Christianity. Europe, by this time, is still leading, right? And you can see Africa. By the time you get to 1970, which I was born in 1979, many of you were in college, or you were much older than me in 1970. Look what happens. African Christianity begins to catch up with North American Christianity. Europe still seems like it's pretty far ahead, right? And then look what happens at the turn of the millennium. So African Christianity overtakes North American Christianity. North American Christianity and European Christianity. Now these are all groups: Orthodox, Protestants, Catholics, all. So we begin to see, a leveling. And then African Christianity begins to just take off. So to the point now where today, the number of Christians on the African continent outnumber any other continent today, right? At the current growth rates, if you project this out to the next out to 2050, look what happens. So on the African continent, by the time I hit retirement, there will be close to 1.3 billion Christians on the African continent. And North America, we'll see growth. Now, my guess is this is going to be predominantly biological growth, so it kind of follows the trajectory of biological growth. And then Europe, you'll see that Europe at the current rate will see a decline. I mean, this is a really interesting chart. Asia will continue to grow, Latin America will continue to grow. And so this is really interesting. Now, this up until this point, this is kind of the state that we're in. This is still the future, but it's the likely future. And so you have to ask the question, as soon as we got to this point, did this change the way that we think about the church in North America? Of course it does. Let me give you a case in point. Back in the 50s and 60s, we didn't talk about multi-ethnic churches. In the Jim Crow area, the best that you talked about in terms of diversity was you talked about integrated churches. As a matter of fact, if you look at the literature, the phrase that they use for it was in all institutions. We talked about the integration of schools, the integration of neighborhoods, the integration of churches. By the time you get to 1990, which you get the influx of immigrants that came in 75 and then also in the 80s. By the time you get to the 1990s, the language completely changes from any kind of verbiage of integrated to multi-ethnic. And so, it's probably by the time you get to 2001, where the term multi-ethnic becomes like more mainstream in the churches. Now think about this. Think about how fast Christianity is growing around the world. How is that going to impact the way that we think about Christianity in America? I mean, I can't tell you all the dimensions, but here is, this is a very small like window, a Hmong American refugee immigrant telling you all, we are in Jerusalem, Grand Rapids, about the future of the church, like the dynamics of what does it mean to be global Christians in North America. Like the implications for that are huge. And so we look at this, big picture. What I want you to kind of take away from this slide, I got tons of slides, we're not going to get through all of them. But what I want you to get from this slide is that like the people in your neighborhood and the stores that are popping up and the different language groups, you all know this already. Anecdotally, you know this already. It is transforming Christianity in North America. And it's probably going to transform Christianity in Western Michigan. It probably is already. And so, we're here in RCA territory where they elected their first Hispanic, Eddie Alleman as their general secretary. And so, that means something. And it's hard to tell right now in 2022. But by the time you get to 2030, 2040, the youth in your churches, they're going to live out the implications of what we're seeing on these charts and graphs. In terms of like the population share of Christianity, again, these are big trends that people much more smarter than us are analyzing right now. If you look at how Pew thinks about the future of Christianity in North America. Now, I'm going to share these things. I'm not the one that's saying, hey, the sky's falling. Like, for me, I'm an optimistic, so I don't like to say, but the trend on the chart is falling. The sky's not falling, but the trend on the sky, on the chart is falling. So these are 4 different scenarios of what is happening to Christianity in North America, all right? We don't know if any one of them are going to be the actual case, but the first scenario is that if switching is like conversion, so Christians becoming atheists, people from other religions becoming Christian. So if switching continues at the most recent rates, Christians would lose their majority by 2060, but in 2070 would still be the largest U.S. religious group. In some ways, scenario 1 is almost kind of like, this is like where you find out when like the number of Christians are less than 50% for the first time. In scenario number 2, if switching continues to accelerate, but brakes are applied, U.S. nuns would be the largest group in 2070, but not yet a majority. So think about this. This is if if things continue at like status quo. This is status quo, okay? This right here is like, if we're trying to like we're planning churches and we're like, the brakes means that we're doing well in our mission, okay? Then at some point, probably 2070, religious nuns become the largest. Now, religious nuns have always been a thing in North America. They were kind of the nominal Christians. They were kind of like your CNE church, Christian and Easter Christians. But they're now just more pronounced. They now decided to shed the label of Christians, right? But this is a growing, especially among millennials and Gen Z. Scenario 3 is if switching continues to accelerate, which means if you and I, we just kind of like, we stop doing our jobs. Like we stop talking about evangelism. We stop talking about church planting. U.S. nuns would form a slim majority by 2070. So we become a religious non-majority nation by 2070. If switching had ceased in 2020, Christians would retain their majority through 2070. So basically, if this is kind of like almost like the best case scenario, like if we all just like everybody just stayed on the same team that they're in right now, then we'll retain majority. But we also know, like, this is probably the least likely scenario out of all of them. And so, again, just what is this telling you? What is it helping you to kind of think about, like, the urgency of the work that we're doing? This is a chart that our institute developed. This is data based out of the YARDA. If you're a church planter, you've probably seen the YARDA database at some point. They're updating their 2020 numbers still, so they're not out yet. But this is the 2010 church to population ratio for the top 10 largest cities in the United States. And so, unfortunately, Detroit or Grand Rapids didn't make the list. But if you look at the national average, which is the bottom, United States, and the population in 2010 was 308 million. Today it's about 328 to 29 million. If you look at, like, the column that says PROT, that's Protestant congregations. The ratio in the middle is church to population based on Protestants. The EV stands for evangelicals, and then the furthest right column is the number of evangelical churches to population. So if you look at this, the national church to population is there's one evangelical congregation for every 1,600 Americans. If you look at the Protestant congregations, it's one church to about 1,000. If you throw in the Catholics and Orthodox, that changes it to about one church to about 900 people, all right? And so, which we should, I believe the Catholics and Orthodox are very much, many of them, sisters and brothers in Christ. And so, but if you think about this is kind of what we're dealing with. So, New York still tends to be the least church. Does anybody know what might be the most churched city in North America? It's not Grand Rapids. You have a hunch?
I was going to say Dallas, having lived there.
Yeah, Dallas is pretty close, but it doesn't show up here. But Nashville is there's about one church to every 600 or so people in Nashville. So pretty interesting, yeah. So if there was a church mecca in the United States, it would be Nashville. Charlotte comes pretty close. Dallas is pretty close. Now here's Kent County. So again, this is 2010 data. This has obviously changed in the last 12 years. Protestant churches about 480, probably closer to 500. And then evangelical churches, 350. Does anybody have better numbers than 350 in Kent County? But that seems reasonably, correct, right?
We had 540 the last time we did it.
Okay.
Before.
Okay, before COVID, yeah. And so if you look at this based on 2010 numbers, you're pretty close to the national average, right? So now that doesn't mean like you're doing well in Kent County. It just means that you're, in terms of like ratios, you're doing pretty well. But you all know behind the numbers whether this is a strong showing or not a strong showing. Because just because you have congregations, it doesn't mean that like you're seeing gospel saturation in neighborhoods, right? And so, but you can kind of better understand like the challenges that other cities experience, and then what does it mean for Western Michigan, which has tended to be a very, Christian, what many of us who are outside of Western Michigan has often thought of as a very Christianized, we think Zondervan, like we think our daily bread, we think the seminaries out here. Like when I walked out of the airplane yesterday, I saw an advertisement for Cornerstone and an advertisement for Calvin, like back to back in the terminal. So for most of us, like we're thinking of Western Michigan in this particular way. But you all know better. Like you all know better of how gospel saturated Western Michigan is. And you also know the unique challenges of what it means to be a formerly church city that is now seeing that like the residual or the residue of cultural Christianity begin to wear off. In some cases, I bet in places like Western Michigan, you're seeing the rapid nullification of the church. That's probably happening at a faster rate than other places. So I'd be interested in hearing some feedback around that. Any feedback around that?
I would just say the closer you are to the core of the city, the more you're seeing that accelerate. And the further you are out in the burbs and the rural areas, it's like it's less
Stuck in
less-
time in
less
some ways?
accelerated,
Yeah, yeah,
Still happening.
yeah.
Generational too. Like the boomers are out in the suburbs, kind of in their enclave, and their kids
Yep.
And the Gen Z and younger millennials are in the core and are kind of like, I'm leaving what I grew up with. Kind of.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Even in the burbs, they're not going to nuns, but like I don't want to go into place political, but we're all aware that what's happening out there is not super Christian. It's just kind of taking place in church buildings.
Sure.
But so my background in association, everything.
Yeah.
That's what's happening in that group. It's not very Christian anymore, but it's still in a building.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and some of those lines are that we used to thought were like crystal clear are now kind of like blurred, and they're kind of moving, stuff like that. You know, and Barna just put out a study post-COVID. The generational cohort that has returned, that has the highest percentage of those who have not returned to Sunday gatherings are actually boomers. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? There's a couple of different factors, you know, health factors and those kinds of things. But I think it's like 26% of boomers who used to attend the church before COVID have not returned. So, you know, there's probably some generational dynamics there to think through. Now, if you were to look at like the number of church starts and closures in 2014 in North America, this was a strong year for church planting. So this was a year where we did really, really well. The network that I was associated with at the time, they planted close to 1,000 churches nationally in 2014. These are Lifeway numbers. Before the pandemic, these are pre-pandemic numbers. In 2019, look what happened. So the number of church closures outnumbered the number of churches that were started. And so there's a lot of different factors, right? This, I think, Lifeway says this is representative of 70% of church planting that they captured here. But there's a lot of dynamics that's happened here. Does it mean that we're failing at church planting? I don't think necessarily that's the case. But I think there's something about the way that we've planted churches over the last 40 years, that model or that way of planting, it's just starting to lose steam. It's starting to, you know, I mean, we might see a resurgence of church planting, but it ebbs and flows. But I don't think, you know, if there was a heyday in church planting, the way that we've been planting churches, that at least the way that I planted churches, maybe not necessarily everybody in this room, if there was a heyday, that was probably in the early 2010 era. And so, you know, we're now, you know, at least a decade removed from that. So there's something about like what we're entering into right now where we've seen a life cycle. I wouldn't say the life cycle has ended, but what I'm sensing, at least from looking at the data here, is like there's an opportunity for us to actually try new things right now, because we realize that what we were doing before, we celebrate, again, like what we started out here, we celebrate the heritage, we celebrate what God was doing, but realizing that that in itself has a life cycle. And we're going to see that in just a second here. There's a phrase here that Peter Wagner used to use that was a very popular phrase that launched a lot of church planting. He said the single most effective evangelistic methodology under heaven is planting new churches. And probably when he said this was probably true, but what he meant was actually in more like pre-Christian environments, right? So this is what he meant. He meant that when you go to a pre-Christian region, that planting churches, and he wasn't thinking about like church planting in the way that we talk about church planting, where you're launching a Sunday service. He was talking about like you're actually in villages, you're actually in, you know, very hard to reach places, and you're doing evangelism, and you're congregating people. And so we adopted his phrase, and in some ways we said starting Sunday gatherings is the most effective way to reach people. So it's an interesting thing. That's not what Peter Wagner necessarily meant, although some of the methodology that he proposes eventually becomes marketing techniques and stuff like that. Like Don McGavran proposed the homogeneous unit principle as an observation of how sociological phenomena like people movements happen. C. Peter Wagner actually put some methodology behind it, and then kind of the church growth folks eventually developed marketing techniques. But for most of us, we thought that starting Sunday gatherings was going to be the most effective way to reach people. And it still, in some ways, is seeing like larger numbers of people making first-time decisions for Jesus because of the way that it's set up, right? You preach a message, you challenge people to either raise a hand or come to an altar call, which, for many people, that was their first moment they met Jesus. But what C. Peter Wagner was saying was actually, no, when you go into the villages, when you go into the places where there isn't gospel ministry and you're doing life and you're seeing people come to Jesus and you're teaching, indigenous leaders, what you are imagining with Plant 616, that kind of place-based ministry. That's what he was saying when he says church planting is the most effective form of evangelism. So we're going to go back to some national trends. This is some work that I did with Warren Bird, who kind of is the statistician in terms of church planting data. This is interesting. Again, we're thinking about like big trends. Like, what has the last 40 years of church planting meant for us, right? Think about the networks, denominations that you're a part of, what has happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years. This chart here is so interesting to me. So this is what we found out in this national survey, that church planter today, the launch median age is 42. It's a 6-year increase over 15 years. And so during the early beginning days of, if I were to say some of these church planting networks, you would know, like Acts 29 was getting off the ground, Exponential was getting off the ground, Stadia was getting off the ground. A lot of these kind of like key church planting organizations, they had just got off the ground. The median age was right around 32, 33, right? And then fast forward 15 years later, the median age is 42. Now, this is not necessarily discouraging because I'm 42. So I like to think I'm still in my prime in some ways. But if you ask the question, so what happens when we get to 2030? Like, is this trend going to continue on? Like, will it be okay if the median age church planter is 50 at some point? Like, at one point, are we kind of somewhat disturbed, right? Like, if this began to plateau like at 38, and we were like, oh, 38 just seems to be, that's when you kind of like, you graduate out of young adulthood, you're more secure as a church planter, and like 38, that's the age that we're kind of pushing people towards. But I don't know. Like, it's hard to tell. Like, there's a lot of factors as to why I think this continues to age, or the median age of the church planter continues to grow. Part of it is because, younger church leaders are being developed for very niche ministry positions at larger churches. So back in 2007, you didn't have a director of social media. You didn't have a digital campus pastor, right? And so what you ended up doing was that was a disgruntled employee that planted a church, or is a disgruntled youth pastor that planted a church. But now you're like, oh, you hire an associate youth pastor and you can actually lead a staff, right? And so there are some of those dynamics. But I think by and large, one of the major dynamics that's kind of aging church planters is that the story of church planting and the systems that we've developed around church planting was a very boomer Xer thing. And it will continue to, grow and age with boomer and Xers. So, and that's just the story of systems and traditions, right? And so, if you follow church planting assessments and processes and those kinds of things, it was when you planted a church, did you get assessed if you were assessed, okay. So, and maybe your assessment wasn't great, but, you went through an assessment. That was a process that most of us went through that was really started to be defined right around the 1980s. 1990s is when you had actual, good systems. And it was actually something that came out of Presbyterians. They developed an assessment process for their home missions, and they borrowed it from their foreign missions. And if you trace that back, assessment was a professional development tool that AT&T and the military used to develop officers and to make sure that they can move people up the ranks. And so we kind of appropriated that for foreign missions, and then the Presbyterians did that for home missions, and then everybody copied it from the Presbyterians. Converge made it better, so Converge at some point was like the leading assessors, and then everybody made it better, and then Send Network, kind of took some things, and then, so this whole process it's a very military professional development system. But again, it's very boomer, Xer, like focused, right? And so you just have to ask the question, so what does that mean? Like what are the things that we want to develop? What are the environments that we want to develop that can help handle the complexity that millennials and Zers are going to be facing? Here's some other interesting data from Warren. These are growth rates of churches by race. So obviously this is not a clean, but these were churches that identified as predominantly either multiracial, predominantly Asian, Black, Hispanic, predominantly white. So what's interesting is that if you look at the launch day attendance, so the first public service that they had, multiracial churches, the predominantly white churches were around 50, and then if you look at the average attendance in 2022, so the median size church in America today is still about 80, 85. So most churches are about 80, 85, right? And so the church plants kind of follow that, right? And if you look at kind of the annual growth rates, that's what, the annual growth rates, the growth of Sunday attendance essentially. If you look at like the startup costs, this is the startup cost for year one based on the racial type of the church. What do you observe? What do you see?
There's a lot more money in the white space.
Say that again. There's a lot more.
A lot more money in the white space.
There's a lot more money in the white space. Okay.
Somebody said it, the money is associated with the cost. What does it cost to plant their church, right? It's not just that they have money, it takes money.
Yeah. So, sure. Because you have staff. You're actually launching with like 3 full-time. Yep. So anything else that you observe?
A greater risk is taken among with larger amounts of money in white or multiracial.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe there's more high impact or yeah. So.
Conversely, the non-majority white ones have a much larger percentile growth in their first year as opposed to their startups. Like the multiracial church is only 3 times as much as the startup, whereas like the Hispanic church is almost 8 times as much.
Yeah.
In its first year cost as opposed to the startup.
Yeah, we did some research at our institute a few years ago, and the headline that was released with Christianity Today is Hispanic churches do more with less. And doesn't mean they don't want more money. It just means that because they don't have more money, it's not going to stop the mission that they're on. I think there was an article that came out this week that the Send Network is seeing a huge resurgence of Hispanic church planting. So, yeah.
Like more
Bivocational, yeah. What's also interesting here is the parallel, I mean, you saw this with this slide here and also the slide here, is the parallel between predominantly white and multiracial churches. And my guess is because multi-ethnic church, again, if you trace it to the 90s, was predominantly a white church thing. And so it was white churches that were trying to become more diverse. And so They developed the language. So if you read Mark DeMaz's book, Planting Healthy Multi-Ethnic Churches, in some ways, although Mark probably would look at it differently now, he definitely does. And even it was a watershed book, Divided by Faith, by Michael Emerson. These were kind of books that were written from a predominantly white space, trying to figure out how to diversify. So the multi-ethnic, multi-racial paradigm was predominantly white, and so I think that's why you see a lot of the parallels. And then you do get a lot of African-American-led multi-ethnic churches as well. But you'll notice that the multi-ethnic churches that are planted by African-American pastors, in some ways, again, I don't want to misspeak, but in some ways, like they took a kind of a predominantly white paradigm of like launching churches, and then they launched multi-ethnic churches. And so, I can mention a couple of African-American leaders that are leading large multi-ethnic churches. Like, let's say, he's a friend of mine, Duran Gray, who's leading a church in Charlotte, North Carolina. His church looks much more like a predominantly suburban white church than it does a historically black church, right? And so, just some dynamics here. These aren't value statements. I'm just kind of giving you some observations here.
Last year, some guys in our Synod Network and I met over this whole topic of multi-ethnic church
Sure.
planting, perhaps as a team. Can you help with a distinction between starting a multiracial church and a multi-ethnic church? Because I know where we landed, but we found ourselves using them synonymous, and then there was this academic who really pushed us to talk about, are we welcoming other races in to join us as
Right.
whites, or are we ready for a church that expresses itself in worship in multiple ways through ethnic expression?
Yeah.
Do you see that same distinction, or?
Yeah, I do, but I also think it's like, I think everybody should do what they're comfortable doing. So I do think multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, when you say those things, they all do mean distinctly different things, right? So, race is a category that we have on the U.S. Census. So, and it was used to historically define how the American government allots money to different municipalities so they can fund things. And so race, at the end of the day, race has to do with how the government funds communities, right? And so it has something to do with our skin color and stuff like that. But it was more, if you follow, I think it's called racebox.com or something, like you follow the development of race in America, and it's predominantly, follows the development of how money is apportioned, which we'll get to in a second here. Ethnicity obviously has a lot to do with like country of origin, language, those kinds of things, right? I think if you're a multiracial church, typically when multiracial is used, it was typically used to talk about like navigating black and white dynamics, and so. Not always the case, but it was predominantly that came out of that. And then multi-ethnic kind of is usually used around trying to integrate those who came from recent immigrant communities. And so there is a linguistic. And then multicultural, what I've found is that people say we're a multicultural church, and that's when they're talking about, because sometimes we'll sing in Spanish, sometimes we actually have a service that is more appropriate to Hindi people, to kind of Indian people, right? So, yeah. But I feel like that's like the rhetorical question.
Yeah.
So I also think what's interesting here, and you all are in Western Michigan, so it's going to be different from where I grew up in Detroit. But think about this. Like, predominantly black churches, the cost of business is still much lower. And the question that I have is, but is this by choice? Or is this by, like this data here, like, this wasn't like in the 60s or the 70s, Like, this is 2021 data, 2022 data. And so I know there's a lot of complexities, as to how to understand this. But if you were to talk to an African-American church planter, any given city, like, they wouldn't tell you, we don't need less money. They wouldn't tell you we're more efficient at church planting than other racial groups. There's something about the design of our system that still perpetuates this, right? And this is where I'm really challenging you how to think, because best practices is only designed for us to improve what we're currently doing. And so do we really want to create best practices around these dynamics? Now, there's a lot under here that we haven't unpacked here, when it comes to finances and year one startup. This is just like a sliver. But what I'm saying is that we're at a very unique point where there's a lot of things that have been revealed about our church planting systems that we get to challenge, we get to tweak, we get to maintain, or we get to leave behind. And so as you're coming together in Western Michigan and you're asking the questions of how do we move forward, not just for your generation, but for the next generation, these are just some things to take into consideration. I was having a conversation with David Block yesterday about what redlining did to Grand Rapids, it's similar but unique in other cities as well. Coming from Chicago, Chicago is probably the most studied city when it comes to redlining. Here's an article that Brookings put out a few months ago. It's a pretty complicated article. But this is the Brookings Institute putting this article out. And the headline is, "Churches are closing in predominantly black communities, why public health officials should be concerned." And here's a paragraph that I pulled out. It says, "To become an equitable nation and to protect all members of the population, we need public policy that prioritizes collaboration with cultural institutions that are salient to people of color. Churches are central to public health efforts in various stakeholders. For example, public health officials, racial equity advocacy organizations, congresspersons, real estate developers. They should pay attention when there are discernible trends in the disappearance of churches in these communities." This is a national think tank saying that if we aren't concerned about the disappearance of churches in black communities, there is going to be a huge public health, and the pandemic was just kind of like a taste, right? And so this is pretty complicated here on the right here, but basically what it shows you is the red dots are church closures. And you see more red dots in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And they trace that to the lack of access to vaccines in New York City. This is just kind of one correlation that they've made. But I found it fascinating. Like, this wasn't research that was like pushed by an evangelical organization. But this is a think tank that's saying we actually need to be concerned about like churches in communities, especially in communities of color. And so as you guys think about the unique dynamics of Grand Rapids and the struggles that certain communities have and what it means to partner across suburban, urban, redefining multiracial. I think, what does a multiracial network look like? I think that's probably, a multiracial network is probably more important to me than a multiracial congregation. Now, you probably do need multiracial congregations in order for multiracial networks to be meaningful. But I don't think, if you don't have a multiracial network or a collaboration, that at some point you're going to be providing goods and services across these like imaginary lines, and you're continuing to just give handouts, and we need more than that, right? Most of our best practices is developed about like one-way like resources. And so some of the things that you might have to think through, whether you're leading a church or you're part of developing a network, is how do you actually begin to help create agency and autonomy and then like self-propelling, and we'll get into that I think in our second session, what does it mean to actually develop networks that actually see things like, this is called Inner-City Christian Fellowship, where it's tied to public domain services, but it's also the church. We're actually going to get into some of that a little bit later. What my friend Myron Pierce calls like side hustle churches. Like we probably need to see more of that. And it's not just bivocational, co-vocational models, but it's something that's actually developing the social equity of a community. And that's what Brookings is actually saying, is that churches don't understand that in order for a community to thrive, if churches don't focus on the social equity of a community, then that community will never thrive. All right, I'm going to stop there, give you a chance to process something, and then I'm going to kind of move a little bit into some trends. So, anything else you guys want to bring into this, or anything about the Grand Rapids, Western Michigan dynamic that you think is interesting for the rest of the group to hear?
Maybe something small as something that I'm joyful to serve in is in full-time evangelistic capacity. And when COVID, I'm just looking at this, and it strikes me personally from experiences that I had as I'm bringing the gospel to the corner, particularly on the urban side of Grand Rapids, on the southeast side. And when we had churches, including the one that I was a member at, shut down, the health concerns, although we're talking about access to vaccines, stuff like that, it seemed like at least here that the state had good control over that, but health concerns that I ran into immediately were regulars who were to the corner, who had fallen back into drug addictions, into alcohol, because accountability, was all of a sudden had disappeared, and so I began having like a real concern for my neighbor in terms of trying to, because a healthy church, generally has maybe a healthy diaconate. You have spiritual leadership. You have congregants who are pulling together. In Acts 2, in the fellowship of the believers, they're breaking bread with one another, selling what they have to provide, so no one was with need. And I don't think that's just having the need of food and water, but also maybe a bill paid, but also spiritual need.
Yeah, sure.
Mental health. And when those things are lacking, Satan is prowling around like a roaring lion, waiting to devour image bearers.
Yeah,
and, so that's just that's something that really struck me, and seeing something such as this, where you have housing surrounded, by a church, that's outstanding.
Yeah. It's something about the Acts 2 that you mentioned, Acts 2:42 on, like, sometimes we think about like the sharing, and we think about they were borrowing lawnmowers and borrowing snow blowers and stuff like that. But what I think Luke is trying to describe there is like they actually developed like a financial ecosystem amongst themselves, which if you study kind of the development of the oikos, like the idea of the oikos is not like our nuclear family, the household. But the oikos in the first century, there's actually a Harvard Business Review article on what the oikos was. It was actually an estate. And so they developed like this ecosystem of a kind of financial, social capital. And Christians learned how to develop that for themselves, independent of the Roman Greco systems around them. And so, I think about what's happening here and the potential of what we can do. Now we're also in a Dutch kind of reformed like part of America, so there's that Kuyperian influence on these ideas. But I also think that like if you think about like what church planting could be, I mean, it's not going to be less than the gathering of Christians, but it's also in some ways getting back to the Acts chapter 2 passage. That you have to think ecosystem. You have to think about how the levers over here connect with the levers over here. And this is church planting training that I think we're getting better at. As I comb through church planting training across North America, we are thinking of community development. So it is gospel proclaim and preach, but it's also Acts chapter 2:42, making sure that we're providing those services for the body of believers and those around them. It says that they won favor among the people, right? And so what they experienced among themselves developed as favor amongst those outside the church. And then what happened? And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. So I'm going to take a quick turn here, and then we'll take a break after this. I'm going to talk about shaping factors. Again, we're thinking about future. We're thinking about like what's looming ahead. And specifically 2050. So So yeah, you're laughing at Marty McFly, right? So anybody seen this Back to the Future? You've seen it, right? All right. So quiz: when were we supposed to have hoverboards? 2015. That's exactly right. So this is how bad we are at telling the future. So I'm not a prophet. I work for a nonprofit. I don't make a lot of profit. So I can't guarantee that what I'm telling you is going to happen. But what I'm telling you is these trends that I'm going to share with you are these are like undeniable. Like they're happening. So these are just matter of fact trends that I'm going to share with you. So it's not going to be revelatory, but it's going to hopefully be affirming of some of the dynamics that you're experiencing. Which, if you think about it, 2050, if you do the math, it's not very far. It's 28 years away. So that didn't seem very far. This is a picture I took last year. By 2050, I'll look like this. So it's not very far, but that looks like Chris's beard. Yeah. Paul Sappho, who's a futurist out of Stanford University, if you've not read him, I recommend his stuff. Really, really good stuff. Now, he's kind of out there because he's a futurist, but really helpful stuff. He says that you have to look twice as far back into the past if you want to understand the future. So if we're looking, 20, 30 years ahead of the future, we have to kind of ask the question, what was the last 40, 50 years really about? Because things happen in life cycles, as I mentioned before. So as I look back to the last 40 years of Christian ministry, specifically in regards to starting churches, specifically amongst evangelical traditions, I think of one person, 2 people, 3 people, but definitely I think about Rick Warren. And so Rick Warren, I don't know what your feelings about Rick Warren. I love Rick Warren. I would say in some ways he's, kind of a faith hero to me. But it's undeniable his impact on like the church in North America. He didn't pioneer the megachurch. D.L. Moody probably led the first megachurch in North America, which is now Moody Church in Chicago, and so which he kind of adopted some of the stuff that he saw in the UK. Rick Warren, probably most of his stuff he took from like a Schuller or somebody like that. But I think what he did was he showed us like rapid church planting in North America in like contextual ways, right? And so whether or not you're a big fan of the seeker-sensitive movement, like that was his attempt as a boomer to try to do some missiological contextual work, And so his idea of Saddleback Sam in some ways, which I think in some ways I would never use. Have you ever seen Saddleback Sam? So he's got a pager here, he's got khakis on, like that was Rick Warren, that was the guy that he wanted to reach. Which Rick is interesting, he's the most energetic person I've ever been around. Like his energy is just like another level. I've never seen anybody tell Ed Stetzer to shut up except for Rick Warren. Like he said, Ed, I'm still pastoring people right now, shut up. And Ed just sits there and Ed just shuts up. So his energy. Think about this. He planted Saddleback Church in 1980. I was not yet even 1 when he planted Saddleback Church. Back in the day when you used to dress like that in churches. There are some churches around where you still dress like that. And so this year, they celebrated 43 years of ministry. As some of you might know. And I'm sorry, I'm just assuming that most of us know who Rick Warren is. But as most of you know, he recently, or is in the process of retiring, I think officially preached his last sermon a few weeks ago. Huge accomplishment, right? With relatively little to no controversy in his ministry. I want you to think about this. We're closer to the year 2050 than to the year when Rick Warren planted Saddleback Church. Like 2050 just seems so futuristic, like it's so far, far away. But if you look at it on the timeline, like we're closer to the reality. 2040, the United States will have no racial majority for the first time, which means by 2040, in about 18 years, by the time my daughter's in college, she's 4 years old right now, or graduated college, whites will be less than half of the population for the first time. In 1980, when Rick Warren planted Saddleback Church, whites made up 82% of the population. And so we're closer to the realities of 2050 right now than we are to when Rick Warren planted Saddleback Church. Inappropriate picture, but I just thought this is just who Rick Warren is. So I want you, again, I just made the statement, when he planted Saddleback, whites were 83%. In 2040, whites will be less than half of the percentage. Which brings us to the first factor that's shaping the church of 2050, is what I call the arrival church. Sometimes we call it the immigrant church or whatever, but it's the arrival church. This is the movie Arrival. Have you guys seen the movie Arrival? Again, I'm that pastor. I'm going to ruin this movie for you. But this is an interesting movie. But it's an alien movie, and essentially alien pods come to planet Earth, and I think there's like 8 pods, and they kind of hover over the cities. And I think this movie kind of focuses on Seattle. And the humans are trying to figure out, why are the aliens here? And over time, there's enough interaction with the aliens where they learn to communicate with the aliens. But they communicate through this really weird symbol language. And so they go into a dream state, without the mushrooms, but they go into a dream state. And then the aliens show them these symbols. And then over time, this particular linguistic professor, she learns this language. And so she eventually masters the language, and then she begins to teach it to the other, like to the Chinese, and then to like the Africans. And so eventually they get to this point where they ask the aliens, okay, so why are you here? Because they're afraid that the aliens are here to destroy and take over the planet. And so the aliens actually eventually disclose to her that the reason why we're here is we're actually sent from the future, because in 3,000 years we face extinction. And so we came back into time to teach you our language so that you can evolve, so that in the future you can help us not become extinct. And I thought it's a beautiful picture about the global church, because in some ways European Christianity went around the world, and during the 18th and 19th century, and the gospel went into Africa, into Asia, and Latin America, and obviously in some parts of Asia, the gospel had already been there. In some parts of Africa, the gospel had already been there. But in terms of modern missions, it went around the world. But now we're seeing that Western Christianity is declining, but it's because that Western Christianity sent out missionaries that now, like folks from Brother Sapa, are coming to North America to plant churches to reach North Americans. And so it's in a sense, the arrival church. And this is dramatically shaping the church in North America. Sociologists out of University of Chicago, University of Illinois in Chicago, Stephen Warner says that the new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. Bar none, if you study any denomination that is growing or slightly growing, it's because of the non-white population that they're seeing. So Southern Baptists reported, I should update these numbers, but this is probably still true. I mean, Tony, you can speak to us. They reported in 2020, Southern Baptists, 60% of churches that were started among Southern Baptists were non-Anglo churches. Now, Southern Baptists have been declining in church membership over the since 2013, 14. It was kind of the heyday. I think it was 16 million. I think it's now down to 14 something million or something like that. Doesn't mean like 2 million people disappeared. They just ended up going to PCA churches and to non-denominational churches and stuff like that. But the reason the Southern Baptist hasn't seen a steep decline is they're planting a lot of churches and affiliating a lot of churches, and at least 60% of them in 2020 were non-Anglo. Now, the only denomination, evangelical group that has grown year after year over the last 30 years, can anybody guess who that group is? Assemblies of God. So check this out. In 2001, the number of whites were 1.85 million. The number of non-whites were 0.8 million. Fast forward not quite 20 years. The number of whites are 1.8 million. The number of non-whites are 1.4 million. Almost largely due to Hispanic growth. And so Hispanics are, I think, almost now a quarter of the population of some of these guys. And so, you know, I think about the movie Arrival, or I think about what I talked about, like this is the Arrival church. And many of them have come here as Christians. You know, I mean, my family came here as non-Christians, but 1 out of 4 immigrants that come to the United States are already Christian. And so these are dynamics that I think are, you know, undeniable. You know, and think about Western Michigan. I think Western Michigan in some ways, you know, I'm in Chicago, so in some ways, I come to you from the future. We've already experienced this for at least 10, 15 years. But Grand Rapids is probably really kind of the pulse of America in some ways. You guys are starting to see like this happen in real time. Any dynamics, anything that you guys want to mention?
I just want to throw out something I was thinking as you talk about race and culture. So I work a lot with people, and just a interesting dynamic that I've been realizing is a lot of their culture is more driven by social media than some of these dynamics here. Right? So you could have a culturally, you know, gal whose dad is white, mom is Vietnamese, and she is as urban as can be.
Yeah.
Right? Or, you know, and so many of those dynamics. So I might have Dutch-Polish dynamics, and I know a little bit of what that means, but as a 14-year-old Dutch boy, he might be more whatever the TikTok trend is. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And that's just a really crazy dynamic that's been messing with me. That you can be from Florida or California, Seattle, or rural Iowa, dancing the same dances and stuff. It's great. And
yeah.
how that dynamic is going to affect what culture means if I'm from Africa. But my culture is just the general America dynamic, I think is
and the generational thing we'll get to in this next trend, but that's huge. I mean, and to kind of illustrate your point, I think people started realizing the effects of globalization, you know, in global identity, you know, kind of multinational citizenship that a lot of people have now these days. You know where Japanese people go to on Christmas, where they have their meal? KFC, right? Isn't that interesting? You know, and so there's kind of this like, you know, you belong to all places, you know, for a lot of people these days, and it's a very interesting dynamic. There's a global identity that people are embracing. However, that doesn't get away. Like I just watched a really interesting Netflix documentary on the plane ride over here about a Vietnamese immigrant vegan that lives in Portland. And this is like one of the emerging restaurants in Portland. And it's this really weird like fusion of American food and her Vietnamese immigrant roots. And she's defining for herself what does it mean to be Vietnamese in 2022. And I think there's a lot of people that are embracing that individualism, that I get to define what does it mean to be Vietnamese. Actually, that's a positive thing. I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing. Right? So we're going to get to that in a sec, though.
Yeah, so I coach football almost exclusively with African American kids, and there is a sense in which yes, TikTok is definitely like I'll hear them singing songs. I'm like, why do you know that song? Because it'll be like late '80s, super white. Sure they don't. But the other 99% of the time they're playing Detroit rap.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's, there is more knowledge, but it's not as.
Yeah. But digital media, definitely. I mean, I don't know if BTS means anything to anybody in this room, but the craze of BTS is such a crazy thing to me. Like, Koreans are dumbfounded at how this Korean pop sensation has just kind of taken the world by storm, you know. And so, and that couldn't have happened prior to, I would say BTS, like, that couldn't have happened prior to probably 2014, 2015, you know, how fast they became a global phenomena, and so much of that is digital media. So, yeah. We'll get into, actually, you know, let's make the transition. So the second factor is generations Alpha and Z and Alpha. So, this is a good book. James White, good church leader. He was former leader of RTS in Charlotte. pastors a church, Mecklenburg, out of Charlotte right now. He wrote this book. He probably would have so much more to say if he wrote it right now, but he says, as the first truly post-Christian generation, and numerically the largest, Gen Z, which I think roughly is 65, 68 million, Gen Z will be the most influential religious force in the West in the heart of the missional challenge facing the Christian church. The oldest of Gen Z right now is 25. So if you're still trying to figure out millennials, move on. like millennials in my neighborhood, millennials in my neighborhood are having grandkids now. So Gen Z, the oldest, is 25. And think about this, like by the time Biden is out of office, which could be in 2 years or 6, probably 2 years, the average church planter should be a Gen Zer, right? If we kind of see a resurgence of young church planters. Just to make you feel even older, do you know who the highest income earner on YouTube is right now? Any guesses? He has the most subscribers, but not Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast is pretty close. This young man, Ryan. My daughter wants to marry him, and I'm okay with that because that's my retirement plan. So this is Ryan's toy review. Currently has 31.8 million subscribers. That's larger than the state of Texas. He has more subscribers than CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC combined. Let's think about that. So, and he's 10 years old. He's a Japanese Vietnamese out of, I think he's in Texas. And I'm not saying he's the most influential person in the world. What I'm saying is that combined with digital media and the emergence of Gen Z, the way that we think about influence has completely changed. You had to be, in some ways, in popular spheres, a movie star or some kind of musician or some kind of, that was the entertainment pathway towards influence. Most of us think that's celebrity. But the emergence of digital influencers, that's another. Jake Paul made like $20 million a couple of days ago by boxing with Anderson Silva. And who is Jake Paul? Does anybody know who Jake Paul is?
Logan Paul's brother.
He was Logan. Who is Logan Paul? YouTubers. He's completely messing up. Some people think improving. He's completely messing up the world of boxing. And how did he get his start? He was making YouTube videos. It's the craziest thing. And so the pathway towards influence has completely changed. YouTube has become a completely different pathway towards it's not going to stop. So I think Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, he's still the highest celebrity. He's made the most money recently in terms of movies and stuff like that. And we'll still have that world of celebrityism and all that stuff. But this emerging world of digital influence is the new future. This is how entertainment is going to be looked at. And this is why, our blockbuster movies are moving to more social media platforms. And less than, you think about the movie theaters. They're just being completely demolished right now because of the digital platform. So, third factor is post-secular prophets and narratives. This one's a little bit harder to kind of really get our minds around. We think about post-Christianity, we think about secularity, but I'm kind of giving you this word post-secular. So it used to be that in the 60s and 70s, sociologists said that if we became more secular, we would become more atheistic. So they correlated secularism with atheism. And there's some of it that's probably not untrue. But in America, the slice of atheism, it's not growing. It's pretty steady, 6 to 8%. It just stays kind of. And so what they began realizing in the 70s, and this is Peter Berger, 70s and 80s, they began realizing that, actually secularism leads to pluralism. And so that's when you get the emergence of the coexistence bumper sticker and the language around tolerance and stuff like that. So we didn't become necessarily an atheistic society, although in some parts of Western Europe it can feel like that. But especially in North America, we became much more of a pluralistic. And so this is how some of the narratives are playing out. So what that means is that, like, what we developed probably 40 years ago, which was our apologetics, was really geared towards like hardcore atheists, right? For some of us, especially if you came up through the ranks of Cru, so this is the Veritas Forum. You guys ever consume a Veritas Forum lecture or debate and stuff like that? I went to the University of Michigan. I remember watching William Lane Craig debate one of our philosophy professors. And, we packed it out. This would have been 1997. We packed it out. And this was how Cru did evangelism, at its best in some ways, other than knocking on doors. That was how as a church planter, I still train people to knock on doors. But this form of evangelism, I'm not saying needs to go away or should go away. But this form of evangelism, this form of framing the world as a very secular, hostile environment, although it does make for great cultural war rhetoric, the reality is that most people don't think of this secular space where it's clean cut, religious people over here and secular people over here. And so this way of thinking about apologetics, that's starting to shift. The narratives are shifting. So think about this. Keller. I'm a huge Keller fan. I'm guessing some of you, have read this book, The Reason for God. It came out of his experience, planting Redeemer Church in Manhattan. I think it was a phenomenal book. I was coming out of my own season of deconstruction. And so when I read this book, it was really helpful to me. I was still an engineer at the time. Really good book for me. But if you think about the influence of his book compared to, and look at his title, Belief in the Age of Skepticism, the Reason for God. So this is a rational apologetic for why you should believe in God. Now, do you think his book did anywhere near as good as this book, Mere Christianity? There is something about the climate of secularism and we feel like we're in a secular world, but what was really the secular world in terms of it's this emergence, hostile, C.S. Lewis, he was in this age where it was that was when all that stuff was happening. Secularism, right? This is when the Scopes trial, all that stuff was happening. And so where we're at today is not so much a secular age, although, secular means a couple of different things. There's a book by Charles Taylor, and he kind of dives deeper into secularity, secularism. It gives you a better understanding. But what I'm saying is that so much of what we've adopted still in our evangelism and apologetics is still based on the world that C.S. Lewis was living in at the time. And I haven't had this conversation with Keller, but a part of me thinks that in his development, he wrote a sequel to the book. He's in Making Sense of God in 2016. And if you're making sense of God, it's much more of an emotional approach. It's much more of understanding pluralism, and it's less about sides. And I don't think the reason for God was about sides. The reason for God was Keller working out his third way approach. If you guys know Keller, he talks about the gospel being a third way. Making sense of God is actually, in my perspective, it's him coming to peace that we live in a pluralistic society. And so how do we winsomely live it in a way where our lifestyle makes sense to people who aren't Christian? And I think in some ways this has become the progression of how we think about apologetics too. We need to live in a way where our life is beautiful, maybe mysterious, but intriguing to other people. It's not a hostile approach. And if we continue to interpret action, now there are times when people have hostility towards us as Christians, But if we think that people are predominantly hostile towards us, then our position in our apologetics and evangelism will always be confrontational. But I think if we realize that, no, we actually belong to a pluralistic society, and probably one of the best things we do, Acts 2:42, is live in a way where our life looks beautiful to people. It's a little bit mysterious, and that mystery actually is intriguing to people. And I think that's what Keller's trying to do, and he's actually tracking with some of the emerging narratives that we see here. Here's some things, some key features of post-secularism. And I bet you in Western Michigan this is probably increasingly true. Dogmatic atheism is unhelpful, perhaps even a little bit mean. So think about this. 20 years ago, evangelicals gave careers to Christopher Hitchens. We gave careers to Sam Harris. We gave careers to Richard Dawkins. Without evangelicals, nobody would know these men's names. Think about that. Isn't that crazy? Richard Dawkins was a biologist, and we gave him platforms to fight against us. And but they don't have the same prominence that they did 10, 15 years ago, because that dogmatic atheism isn't helpful, and some people even think, that's pretty mean. Religious pluralism is assumed, welcomed, maybe even valued. I did a lot of ministry in Canada, and so this is just assumed. And this is where it's maybe a little bit harder in places like Western Michigan, where, especially when you have a Kuyperian worldview, or maybe not you, but that's such a part of the culture in Reformed churches. But part of it is I just assume that I'm a part of a pluralistic society, and that is, and I don't think that means that we're not doing our part to see Christian values lived out. But you just understand that the context is pluralistic, right? And then thirdly, it's okay to appropriate religious language for secular use. I mean, this has been happening for probably 10 years, but the resurgence of language like guru, Canva, Dave sent me his presentation earlier from Canva. Canva has a chief evangelist officer, and so again, just appropriation of religious language, that's okay, right? So, and then here's the last factor, and then we'll come to a stop. Is our strength in orthodoxy and commitment to evangelicalism. I'll be real careful about this one. This is huge, especially for highly churched areas. I thought it was interesting that I actually found a evangelical evangelometer. I didn't create that, so apparently this is a thing. How evangelical are you? Especially here in Western Michigan, where books have been written about evangelicals and how terrible we are and stuff like that. So, but the idea of being evangelical right now is such a in some circles it's controversial. In other circles, it's a non-conversation. Evangelicals make 25% of the American population, so we're actually a very large minority, and we're also a very vocal minority in America, and we're not shrinking. The percentages kind of go 21, 23, 25, but we're not shrinking. We'll be pretty steady. Obviously we're hoping to grow in some cases. But the way that we talk about evangelicals is more and more increasingly about the culture that we've developed, and less about the orthodoxy and the mission, right? And I think I don't feel like I'm at danger of stepping on anybody's toes. I think you all would probably agree to some version of that. It reminds me of how we think about Protestants. So, now, when was the last time you identified as a Protestant? Maybe, say it again.
Reformation Day.
That's what I was saying. For most of us in this room, the only time you talk about the Reformation is on Halloween. Where he's talking about Martin Luther. But you rarely talk about being a Protestant, but you are a Protestant, right? And in some ways, evangelicals is kind of becoming something like that. But for some of us, the reason why we don't use Protestantism is there's an association with Protestantism with mainliners, obviously, and with mainliners with liberals and progressives. And so that's why some people choose not to first identify as Protestants. And if you come from a Catholic background, then you're just kind of, picking a fight if you say I'm a Protestant. So where people have conflated Protestants with progressivism, people are now conflating evangelicals with fundamentalism, right? And so I'm not saying we should do away with the term. So I don't know if you guys know who this guy is, Greg Locke out of Tennessee, but CNN wants people to believe that this is the face of evangelicals. You can Google Greg Locke later or not, but he's good friends with, I won't say names, but whether or not we use the label evangelical or not, it's probably less important about us doing the work that evangelicals have been doing for, the 250 years that evangelicals have become a thing. And I think what's important for us is, as we're thinking about the next generation, we keep coming back to what you were saying, Max, and a few others. We're talking about the next generation, and this is where, thanks for plugging my book, David. It is a good book, mainly because of the other co-authors who wrote on it. But I do have a concern. I do have a concern about, if we're not aware of how evangelicals are being talked about and how we interact online. Everybody sucks at Twitter. Everybody's terrible at Twitter. And non-Christians do it worse than Christians sometimes. But that's not we shouldn't brag about that, So the way that we interact, all that has implications for how my kids and your grandkids think about this project that we call church planting, this project that we call. Because everything that we do in church planting right now is precipitated by evangelical culture, tradition, and conviction. And so if we're not concerned about the perception of evangelicals, and if we don't actually win back, in a sense, that idea of what does it mean to be an evangelical, it doesn't matter if we're planting micro, mega, or meta churches, whatever we end up planting, it could be a very progressive, church, or it could be a very Christian nationalist church. It doesn't matter. If we don't win back the essential truths of the gospel and come back to this idea of what does Orthodox Christianity mean for our time, then what we end up planting aren't churches, and they're not church planters that we're sending out. And I do think this is the heart and soul of our project, and this is where you have to do a lot of deep evaluation. Deconstruction is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I think deconstruction, we all go through some version of it. Paul Tripp, I think he put out some stuff around deconstruction that I think is helpful for all of us. He actually says that if you don't deconstruct the way that we do religion, our traditions become so intertwined with our liturgy that eventually it becomes idols. And so deconstruction is the thing that keeps our cultures from becoming idols in our religious tradition. And I think that's true. And I think that at this juncture in evangelicalism, that I wouldn't say that we're specifically uniquely in danger, but the fact that, somebody like Russ Moore, his name may or may not mean anything to you. The fact that 4 years ago he says, let's put a moratorium on the usage of the phrase evangelical. That should disturb all of us. That the perception of evangelicals has completely been changed. Again, you and I, we don't think of ourselves differently. We still think of ourselves as people on mission. But increasingly, our mission has been co-opted by other definitions. And so the work that we're doing just seems to perpetuate what other people think we are, as people who are either religiously oppressive, or overly nationalistic, or overly racist or bigoted. And so in some ways, we have to become more nuanced in the way that we talk about ourselves. And I'll leave it with this last thing, and we'll take a break, Dave, and you can kind of lead us for our break. But the reason why I'm concerned about this particular, and I think it'll especially land here in Western Michigan. I know there's a strong mainline presence here in a formerly Catholic, but in places like Western Michigan, So much of evangelical culture is defined for us and it's exported. So disproportionately out of Grand Rapids and Colorado Springs. Think about that. Disproportionately, and part of it is publishing. It's not just publishing. But you all have had a disproportionate, because Grand Rapids is not very, what's the metropolitan population? Okay, yeah, so not huge by any means, right? But in terms of evangelical culture, you all have, in the last 50 years, been a big part of defining what that means. In Colorado Springs and then some other places. And then, if you get into like churches, obviously, mega churches in Dallas, Texas, and stuff like that. But because of the publishing and the ministries that are headquartered and those kinds of things. And then some of the families as well. And so I think there's something about what you all get to to create, you all prophetically get to kind of put out, that I think will challenge the rest of the church in America to, regardless of whether or not we call ourselves evangelicals, that matters less to me. But can we live out the core convictions of what we say? And we're about the Bible. We're about seeing people come to know Jesus personally. We're about social action. And we're about the crucifixion of Jesus. And these things have to matter to us. It doesn't matter how you vote, red or blue, but if these things fall by the wayside, whatever we end up doing, it's not the church. And whoever we end up sending, they won't be church planters. So let me pray for our session, and then Dave, you can kind of lead us through the break. Father, thank you for this time. I know there's a lot more for us to dive into. I pray that as we take a break, that you would continue to refresh our minds and help us to engage in our next session. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Before it was a thing, and it's good to get to know him. And we at ICCF, we are Christian community development is our thing, and at the core of that, Dr. John Perkins, one of my heroes, when they asked him to look back on his life, what was in his career and his ministry, what was it, any regrets you might have? And he said, we've done a lot of great things. We've seen a lot of nonprofits started, a lot of ministries. I would have focused more on the church. And so I took that to heart.
Yeah.
He takes the church very seriously. Jesus takes the church very seriously. So it's really neat that we get to, as an organization, we really embody the idea and principles of Christian community development. And so that means at the heart of it is the church. And so whenever we do a tour or tell the story of this building, you can't do it without the church. So Brad's going to kind of tell his story and the story of the building, and welcome to ask some questions. When we're going to get to lunch, we're going to do this, some discussion time, and then lunch will be served, and I'll be doing some tours of the building. So if you want to see some of the ICCF offices, and I'm happy to do some tours as well. With that, Brad, that's 4 minutes. Thank you.
All right, I'll keep it pretty brief here, about 10 minutes, so hold me to that. My name is Brad Knetch, and I serve as the campus pastor here. This is a multi-site of Madison Church. So Madison Square Church campus is down the street about a mile or two, which has been around a long time, more than 100 years. So we celebrated the centennial in 2014. And in the 2006, 2007, the Square campus had about 3 services on Sunday morning, and Pastor Dave Phelan, the senior pastor at the time, he had a heart for multi-site. And instead of building buildings, just serving in different contexts during the week. And so the Ford campus started in 2008, the year of our Ford ICCF, and the vision behind that campus was at the core of that. We're going to pull out the bleachers in church on Sunday morning, but that affects our heart to look back on his life, what was in his career. So being on mission, tutoring, coaching, supporting teachers, just every year we raise the staff, what do they need, and then the community, the church, staff that come alongside those needs. So it was a riot for a whole number of years, and this building came vacant in 2000. So this building is the original Christian High of Grand Rapids. And this building has quite a history, a racial history. So in the 60s and 70s, This
Brad's going to
school
kind of tell his story and
out of the
building.
building. It's
And,
very large, about 1,000 students.
We're going to do lunch. We're going to do this,
Christian High
some
campus.
discussion time, and then lunch will be served, and I'll be doing some tours of the building. So if you want to see the
And then overnight, this place became DHS, the Department of Human Services.
with that, right?
And this chapel that they would fit about 400 kids in here. And the floor wasn't level, it was recessed. But then when DHS came in, they leveled it with concrete, and it then became the records room down the street. So there were these really high cases that went all the way, storage cases that went all the way up to the ceiling, and every welfare case was stored here. It was a chapel, but then became the records room. And so DHS was in this space until 2009. So yeah, this glass ceiling was here. They just moved down the street in 2009, and it just sat vacant year after year. And the developer, Ed DeVries, he gifted this building to Madison Church in 2000, and the vision behind 15 was, and he gave us the keys, and his hope was that this building would be restored and be used 24/7. And we had no idea how. Completely in over our heads, and so we just put up a big sign on the corner that said, "Seeking partnerships, help us rebuild community." And we got all sorts of different applications and different ideas. My favorite, I was just telling Chris, was we never wanted a roller skating rink on the ceiling. So for about a year or two, we would just go door to door and ask folks what do they want to see happen here. And as the years went by, a couple of different repeating themes kept coming up: affordable housing, place for the community, and affordable childcare as well. So those three we just kept praying about. I remember one time I called the men's ministry to just go up on the roof, and we did. And we prayed all night, and just asked them to grab their sleeping bags, because a number of different conversations were happening, in particular with the Inner City Christian Federation. And so, fast forward to 2 years ago, we were able to move in here. The Inner City Christian Federation, they have 41 apartments of affordable housing on the second and third floor. There's a separation between this space and all the apartments, and we're learning how to neighbor well here in this space. We also lease out the first floor to the YMCA, where they run early childcare. And there's about 80 kids down there right now. And we just finished a playground, which was the last part of construction. Many years of conversations, open doors, closed doors, and just trusting God by faith. And by prayer, every week, a team meeting here at 6:30 and walking with big signs. About a decade. It's been happening. Active prayer on Tuesdays. Help us rebuild. So yeah, that's a little bit about the story of this space. This floor went down with my favorite, and then they filled it up with sand and leveled it up. And the church is the anchor. So it's these three: the YMCA on the first floor, ICCF in their hub here, their staff, and the church as well. But I will be honest about this, because you guys are talking about church planting. For years, we'd be in the gymnasium setting up chairs and having kids help with this, affordable housing, and so much ministry in the school across the street. I still miss it. Because everything's done now. So those three, it's been such a marathon to get to this place. Like my best ministry, miss the soccer field out here. But with church planting, it's all hands on deck. But now it feels like we have a new marathon because it's all hands on deck. And so excited about the future. Fast forward to 2 years ago, we were able to move in here. I mentioned this too, because redlining was brought up. 41 apartments. This corner is right on the street of a lot of. There's a separation You just go this a block south, and you'll find properties, vacant property as well, under 50 grand. You go up a half block this way in Heritage Hill, $1 million properties. So as we sit on this very important sociological and historical corner, representing the gospel and living into his call to be faithful witnesses of Christ is really important. And at Madison, we lean into these conversations of race and create different spaces, classes to also explore the history of Grand Rapids, the history of this space as well, and what God has called the church to be about. I could definitely talk and keep going, but I want to honor your guys' time. I know we'll get a bit more of a tour. That's a little bit of the latest from Madison side here. Yeah, so we call this an indoor neighborhood. We do not have to leave the building to do outreach. Years in the hallway, and if I'm working on a message on a Saturday night, most oftentimes I'll smell weed right outside the door because it's legal, and residents, a number of them enjoy that. But it makes for great conversations and inspired sermons. But yeah, there are people that live here, but also we have 2 residents right here as well. With church planting, it's all hands on deck. So when we have weddings and different events, we want to neighbor well. There's another set of apartments right beside the church windows, 15 feet away. There was one Sunday, there were a couple of kids throwing rocks at the windows right during worship. So we had a couple of our guys go outside and just invite them inside. And they came and they joined us. So it keeps us on our toes. And so outreach is very much a part of the DNA here, and that we just follow the Spirit as it leads. Under 50 grand, you go up a half block this way at Heritage. Here's one thing that came up when Daniel was speaking. I remember Coach Gordon giving a talk at a CCDA conference, representing the gospel and living into. This was a number of years ago in Chicago. And who wrote the book Real Hope for Chicago, helped start CCDA with John Perkins. And he was talking about gospel saturation in the neighborhood. And he got up there and he said 15. That was the title of his talk, 15. I said, 15 what? And he said 15 years. Give a minimum of 15 years to a corner, to a block, for long-term gospel saturation. It doesn't happen overnight.
Wow.
So it's church planting and then church sustainability to walk with folks through the ups and the downs.
That's good.
So last year, the first baptism that we had here was a resident. It was awesome because it's legal. A number of them. He was also evicted, but it makes for great conversations and inspired sermons. So walking with him through the ups and the downs. But having a long-term view. You're not just. This is a shiny new building, but like Daniel said, church is about people. This is just a building. This thing's got to be used for the kingdom. So and my wife, I've learned that mostly from her about being in a family. She runs the city kids. We had a couple of guys go outside. If you guys are ever interested in having a bunch of young, passionate kids, so keep us on our toes. That's what they do. They go all over the stages and very much a part of worship. That's some city kids. So keep that number in mind. 15 years.
Yeah. Wow.
Here's one that came up.
Thanks, Brad. Great.
So December 1, we're going to buy you lunch. If you'd like to come back to learn, if your church is interested in doing something related to housing, or you'd like to go a little deeper, we're doing a lunch. We'll buy you lunch. We'll go a little deeper to give you some opportunities. So if you're interested, I got a bunch of these. If anybody wants them, hands up. Cool. Thanks. Daniel, you got it.
Yeah. Brad, thanks for sharing that. It helps give me more perspective on my walk over this morning. I want to show you all a picture that I took. Let's see. Okay. It's hard to tell, but I think this is the end of Heritage Hill. So from that turquoise house on are probably the $1 million homes that you're talking about. And then that white house up north is where, and so I walked over and I Wikipedia'd Heritage Hill. Like I'm a really good church planter and like missiologist, so I got my source from Wikipedia. And like a lot of neighborhoods like Heritage, and I say this not to be condescending. I think we need to honor all stories. But it was interesting that Heritage Hill was protected in the 1960s because of things like of crime, and everybody you want what's good for yourself, right? You want what's good for you. So like most neighborhoods that historically were trying to, there's the red line neighborhoods, and then there were the neighborhoods that were trying to be protected from having their properties bought. It's such a, that line is not as invisible. That is a visible marker of the effects of redlining. And I know that that doesn't just affect African Americans, because it does affect African Americans, but it affects even poor white people, and then it affects the immigrants that are coming into it, and it affects the rich, affluent as well, because for those of us who think that we can protect ourselves from the worldly encroachments, the reality is that we become impoverished when we don't live with certain levels of diversity. And so I love that we're literally at the intersection of red line districts, and you all are trying to bring Jesus to in a sense to the border. And so I'd love to maybe start off our time praying for you all, and just blessing the work that Jesus is doing here and honoring the story. So, Father, thank you for what you're doing, that the church, maybe definitely imperfectly, but the church, your people, Spirit-filled people, are trying to create some stake in the complex history of our nation, and how we continue to stumble, but also hopefully stumble forward into creating a more beautiful society, and a more flourishing society. And thank you for Madison Square Church, and for ICCF, and the families in the communities that started this building that used to be a high school. And Lord, the people that have tried to bridge, this particular neighborhood. And God, I just pray that you would, as they're, kind of pushing into that first trimester of their 15 years, God, that I pray that you would bring up those who have grown up in this area, those who not just have studied the history but lived the history, that you would see a generation of leaders raised up through the work that's happening here at the church, through the housing, through the work that's happening through the YMCA. And Lord, I feel very honored and humbled to hear this story. I just think it's a beautiful representation. And Lord, I want to honor those on both sides of the line. Lord, there are no, in a sense, evil parties, but we know that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. It's against the principalities, the powers, the rulers of the air. And Lord, we pray that you would decrease that influence and increase the beauty of Christ, the work of the Holy Spirit, and the fatherhood of God in this area, so that more might come to know you, and that communities would be developed in the image of the kingdom of God. And we thank you that this little plot of land that we're on right now, is trying to represent that and trying to be that. And so we honor it. We bless it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thanks again for sharing. We're looking forward to the tour here. We're going to jump into our session on collaboration, and a bunch of slides. I'm probably going to skip a bunch, but I'll make them available to you. Let me do about 15 minutes of content, and then we'll get into some discussion. And then Dave, and Chris, if you guys want to interject anything or ask questions in the midst of it, don't be afraid to stop me. We talked about the church growth movement a little bit earlier, and just curious from you, what do you think we gained from it, and what do you think we lost from it? So what are some positives, and what are some of the maybe setbacks, or maybe some blind spots?
If I remember correctly, the quote that you put up in the beginning, I can't remember the gentleman who quoted it, but it was essentially about the best methodology
Sure.
for
Yep.
church planting. I think that answers this question in that what we lost was precisely, at least in my mind, I originally disagreed with the statement because I thought it was about getting a building,
Right.
And all that, and then you shared the context, and I go, wow, like I really lost that, in terms of what I thought that it was now. So, according to that quote, and at least maybe the general temperature of the church, perhaps we had one thing that we had lost was what a solid, back to basics, biblical, evangelistic methodology actually is.
Okay.
Reaching the lost and watching the church be built, and then watching that organism grow on its own, I suppose.
Yeah. Which is interesting because earlier, I think the church growth movement thought of themselves as primarily an evangelistic movement. If you trace it back to the 70s and 80s, early on, a lot of the ideas around it was how do you effectively reach people, but it becomes something a little bit different later. What else? What else do you think we gained or we lost?
My context, I grew up in a group of churches that, so if you're talking the 80s, we're having actual arguments, and to a certain extent they continued to their own death, over whether the church had a responsibility to do evangelism or the church's role in evangelism. These were not theologically nuanced debates. They simply just wanted to exist. So I feel like one of the things we gained from the church growth movement was this idea that, no, it's God's will that other people hear about Him.
Yeah.
And so, at least in the context I grew up in, I would attribute a lot of that to some of the church growth movement causing a very healthy tension that needed to be caused.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you mentioned Rick Warren earlier, he brought the lost into his ecclesiology. If you remember his little circle, the concentric circles, you guys ever seen that? So you've got the core, which again, he would probably, I don't know if he would do it, I would do it differently, but he put the core at the center, which again, I don't know if that's very helpful. Well, maybe Christ is at the center, right? We all would agree with that. And then you have concentric circles, but then you have like the community, or he would cut, like the lost. And so the lost is actually brought into the ecclesiology, So any other, losses or gains from this? Yeah. I think in some ways, and Don McGavran, when he was describing what became the homogeneous unit principle, it was based off of his experience in India, because he was a missionary in India, and he was saying that it's easier to reach Indians if they reach those who are like themselves, and it's a social boundaries. It's like if you're a completely different language and completely different cultural group, you're less likely to come into a worship gathering together, and so that was his observation. He didn't make it a principle; it was an observation. And then others kind of became like, if you had Saddleback Sam, then you would actually grow your church faster. So the distance between what he was proposing and the way that many of us lived it out was a huge chasm, right? And so, a lot of interesting things. Part of what I think collaborations or collaboratives, Plant 616, the framework for how church planting exists, I think a part of it there needs to be a de-emphasis or a reframing of how we think about church planting. Because so much, like it's even hard, you can't imagine church planting without church growth. Like we just can't. Like, I mean, that's so much of who we are these days, right? And it's not to say that if you were going to a pre-Christian context that you wouldn't have some version of church growth. But like it becomes a little bit easier to disentangle church growth methodology if you were planting churches, let's say in Iran, for instance, right? Like then you begin to understand, oh, okay, I see how intertangled we become with church growth methodology. Because once you start looking at different mission contexts, you begin realizing that, okay, this is just a methodology. This is not like Bible. And so what I'm suggesting is not Bible necessarily either, but I think it's a broader or more like comprehensive framework for church planting. And that's this idea of city reaching. And so not going to be completely revelatory to you all, but what I'm hoping to challenge us towards is to not think predominantly of growing local churches, but thinking about like city reaching. Others have used the term gospel saturation. Others are using the terms movements. But it's this idea of how do we actually think of holistically, our city or region, right? City is somewhat of a limited word. So don't think of city just in terms of municipality, but like the ecosystem that encompasses the city and the dynamics, including urban, suburban, and rural dynamics as well, because the thread that ties the three together is huge now, especially with the expansion of the exurbs. Are you guys familiar with the exurbs? Like that's becoming a huge phenomenon. And so I think there is a framework. And this is going to be predominantly important for those who lead like church planting churches or church planting networks, if you're a mission pastor, because you begin realizing that it's just not about like how our church does things. It's about how do we actually work as the church in the city, right? So this is going to push us towards how to think about city reaching or collaboration. So city reaching movements ask, how can Christians and churches be part and parcel to the flourishing of our city? It's a little bit different than the question church growth asks. So within this framework, church planners, they have to answer, what does it mean for new Christians and new churches to flourish in the city as they play their role in a city reaching movement? And this is, it doesn't change completely the way that you do church planting or train church planters, but you're constantly forcing them to remember that they belong to a larger context. And not just their denominational tribe, not just their tradition, but to the church in the city, right? And at some point, if you're really, really like a maverick, then you also say, okay, how does this relate to the Catholic Church and to the Orthodox Church? But let's just kind of stay in the Protestant stream for now. But you're helping to constantly, now, we're going to get to this a little bit later. You can't partner with everybody, and that's not what we're saying here. But as a church planter, you have to be cognizant that you exist in a context and in multiple traditions, and that if you embrace that, what you end up developing is actually going to be more beautiful than just trying to grow your church and your tribe and your tradition. So you're asking the question, what does it mean for new Christians and new churches to flourish in the city, especially as they play their role in the city movement? So city reaching movements require high levels of collaboration. If you're connected to the CCDA movement that Chris and Brad, you guys were mentioning earlier, you understand some of this. So there's kind of the Venn diagram of church growth and planting, holistic ministry partners, and for at least some time, some of us have been forced to try to bifurcate the two. This church, parachurch, there's kind of mercy ministries over here, there's evangelistic ministries. And I don't think that's unnecessary. I don't think that's necessary. But then there's also now the dimension that I think people are becoming much more aware of, and that's city planning. And so how do we just not plant churches in a vacuum, but how do we do it in the context in which the city leaders are actually developing the city? Grand Rapids, as much as I know, I'm no expert in Michigan, but other than Novi, Grand Rapids is the only city that's like grown year after year in the recession. I don't know if is that still true? Like, that's not the case for Detroit. Novi's kind of an anomaly for a couple of different reasons. And so your city is growing. Why is it growing? Why are the leaders making the decisions that they're making? What are some of the issues? I thought it was brilliant, Brad, that you all just said, hey, we've got a building. What do you guys want to do? Like, I think that's brilliant, because you're saying we want to grow our churches with the growth of the city. Or if your city's not growing, if you're in the rural area and things are stagnant, then but you're still doing the same thing. What are the plans that the city leaders have? And so at the intersection of these things, that's where you begin having a better framework, what I would call city reaching. And so what it forces you to do is it forces you to have one conversation in the public sphere. You don't just have the evangelical Christian church planting conversation over here, and then when you're over here, you're kind of like, you're serving schools and stuff like that. You're actually this is all part of the same conversation, right? What was interesting was the pandemic, in some ways, was both apocalyptic and catalytic for us. Like, it revealed some things about how, in some ways, how self-centered we were as churches and church leaders, especially if you're like a really strong preacher and you needed to preach to big crowds. Like, it revealed a lot about our hearts. But it was also catalytic for a lot of folks, because for some pastors, they were like, I was so happy to just finally get people out there and serving, and so in some ways, like, people got to live into like their missionary identity as well. And the pandemic was this two prong process. It was apocalyptic, it was catalytic, and in some ways, it doesn't mean like we learned the lesson. As a matter of fact, some of us got back into our buildings as quick as we could. Some churches, by and large, grew after the pandemic. Their attendance on Sunday grew. Now, there's a lot of reason for why there's growth. There's some churches that saw a lot of evangelistic growth. I can't tell you a whole lot of those stories, but there are stories of churches that saw evangelism. But there are a lot of churches that closed as well, right? And so I won't be shocked if we see 2022 numbers that surpass the 2019 numbers. 4,500 churches closed in 2019. I won't be shocked if that was closer to 5,000 coming out of the pandemic. But we learned some things, and I hope that some of the things that we learned will lead us to more pioneering. Now, I want to show you the current model of how we predominantly think about like church planting in a city. All right. I'm not saying everybody does it this way, but what I'm saying is that for most of us, you'll be familiar with this. And it starts with like the church planting pipeline. So this is currently how I understand how we plant churches in cities. And so if you're really, really good, you'll start with like an intern. So how many of you have got a church planting intern maybe in your pipeline system somewhere, right? Okay. So most of your church planting residents have no clue what to do with this person, right? And then they go through a residency, and then they get assessed and trained, and then they get sent out, and then hopefully they plant a church. And then if you're if you're Tony over here or someone else, you're shaking bushes, you're looking under rocks, you're trying to figure out how to fill this pipeline. And so you're anybody's got a pulse, come to our assessment. You don't do that, Tony, but so you're actually going to nonprofits and parachurches, and you're like, oh, entrepreneurs, business guys, you would make a good church planter, which is not necessarily true. I actually think our overemphasis on entrepreneurial skill sets, like an entrepreneur is not the same thing as a church planter, and back in the 90s and 2000s when we said you got to be a maverick, you got to be an entrepreneur, like I think in some ways that did a disservice to us. Didn't mean that like you shouldn't be a catalytic person, but the whole language around entrepreneurship and being a maverick, I think in some ways it was one step forward, two steps back. So the idea is because you want to plant more churches, and so this is based off of like some work that we did in Chicago. In this particular system, this year we saw, I think it was 2018, 75% of church planters get assessed. That's pretty high. It used to be 50%. And so part of it is because our pre-assessments are getting better. 70% of churches exist after 4 years. That means if you run 12 candidates through it, you plant 9 churches, 7 churches exist after 4 years. That's not terrible. But if you look over the impact of that cohort of planters, that's 7 churches, average church is 124. That's large, right? That's large. That's about 868 total people in those churches. Lifeway numbers, 60 converts, new decisions for Jesus, and about 420 new people that have come to Jesus through church planting in a typical city church planting system. All right. So, not saying you all are involved in this, but you understand this process, right? So this wouldn't be foreign to most of you. Now here's the thing. This is what's hard for Tony's job. I'm using Tony as an example. I don't know if there's any other denominational leaders here. But the pressure that folks like Tony feels like this is our job is to widen the pipeline. And that's, I don't know if you feel this pressure, Tony, but so, and this is our paradigm for church planting in the city. And so we collaborate to widen the pipeline. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not making a value statement. This is the way that we do things. But the question is what's the likelihood of you tripling, quadrupling your pipeline capacity in the next 5-10 years? Small, right? Yeah. I mean, we want that. We pray for that. But you can't. Like, the system is not built to be tripled or quadrupled. And so we have to ask the question, again, I'm thinking about the kids in 2050. And you have to think about this. For every year we're not figuring this out, we leave an increasing burden for the next generation to figure this out for themselves, right? And so what I think city reaching forces us to do is it forces us to decentralize this process. This is still, somewhat of an important process, whatever version of this, but it forces us to decentralize this. And I love that we're in this building because in some ways I feel like we're getting a little bit of a glimpse into what would happen if you had a city reaching framework for church planting. And so basically the idea would be you still embrace the pools that you're in. So businesses, public sectors, nonprofits, parachurches, things like ICCF. But you're helping them to think through what does it look like to develop their own pipelines and their own, in a sense, churches. Not everything's going to be like Madison Square and ICCF. Not everything can be this. But how do you start helping to democratize and decentralize church planting? We can't quadruple the capacity. And so this forces us to kind of think about so we did this with housing. How do we do this with the medical district? How do we do this with health and fitness? Right? And it's more like we started getting a little bit of this with the coffee shop church. But then we just stopped. And then we started doing, some people are trying to do CrossFit. And I'm not saying that we have to do CrossFit church or stuff like that. But it really is this thing. How do you actually see that God actually has these places baked into the makeup of our city? And these are legitimate places to make disciples and to make disciple makers. And you might have a partnership like Madison ICCF, and that's kind of where you develop it. I'd be interested to see over the next 10, 20, 15 years if you all are sending out church planters. That'd be amazing. But in some ways, it's reimagining, why is the church engaged in this space? Why are we engaged in housing? Most definitely is so we have housing equity. There's no question. But how does that impact disciple making? How does it impact the way that you think about mission? How does it impact the way that you send out leaders? And so there's got to be some version of this if we have a shot. And there's got to be some version of you all that are creating pathways so that the next generation has a shot at something like this. Because the likelihood of folks saying, I love Tony's job. Imagine a 25-year-old saying, one day when I grow up, I want to be a denominational leader to widen that pipeline. Now, Tony, I'm not saying.
I've got a lot of guys that want my job.
Oh, okay, there you go. Well, how much is your salary? Yeah. It's hard to imagine, and we're sitting in the RCA, CRC territory. I'm very aware of some of the battles that are going on here in this territory or this region. We're sitting in an area where people don't want to lead institutions forward. And so how do we democratize, decentralize the call of Jesus so it's not completely reliant on the growth of our institutions? I'm not saying I know how to do this, but this is a question that we have to struggle with. Okay, a couple more things, and then just time check. Can I do 5 more minutes?
Yep.
Okay. And then, there's a bunch of stuff that I'll send you. Really good stuff. It'll change your life. I just don't have time to go through it. I'll end with this. Think about how much, when you think about city reaching, it can no longer be about like one network. So it can't be about just what you're doing. So we're talking about not just your local church, but it just can't be about your tribe either. It forces spaces like this to be the norm. This is the norm. Because I'm not aware of what you're doing at Madison Square unless I come to these spaces. And so it forces this to be the new norm of how you think about planning, how you think about like collaboration. So on the most practical level, as a local church leader or as a denominational leader, as a network leader, you're constantly asking this question: how much energy is given to city collaboration? So think about it in terms of energy and not just budgets and time. Because your budget and your time will eventually follow your energy. So think about it in terms of putting out unnecessary fires, maintaining your ministry, and investing in city collaboration. So for some of us right now, a lot of our energy is given to maintaining your ministry. Coming out of the COVID, coming out of the pandemic, you may feel like this is most of us, right? For some of us, this is the likelihood is most of us, this is us. We're just constantly putting out fires, right? And no shame. Like this, if you went into ministry because you were called to pastor people and to love people, you're dealing with people who are getting evicted. This is just kind of, ministry for you. For some of us, this is probably unlikely. Some of us, this is going to be our job, but for some of us, this is investing in city collaboration. But at this point, if this is who you are, you're probably a convener. You're probably someone who's trying to develop better information for your region. You're trying to get people to talk to each other. And so there's a lot of energy being spent here. I don't think that you can get to being a city collaborator by primarily being a local church pastor. At some point, you're probably given permission to spend most of your vocation trying to create rooms like this and sustain the momentum here at some point. The question that I want to pose to you all, and I apologize, we just skipped over a bunch of stuff, but what's the appropriate organizational energy distribution for the immediate future? Coming out of COVID, coming out of coming out of, in a sense, even church growth. We're not out of church growth, but kind of coming on the tail end of church growth. What's the appropriate energy that we should be giving towards collaboration? And I think that's an important question. Because how we answer this question, how much energy am I giving to city collaboration, I think is going to be a part of the kinds of resources that we'll develop, that we'll put into the hands of Gen Z or church leaders so that they can lead the mission forward. If we continue to do best practices of our tribe, we will not innovate anything substantial for the next generation leaders. It's in the collaborative spaces that will create new things that will be imperfect. So the microchurch conversation, I don't think a microchurch is a silver bullet. But I do think microchurch is some kind of iteration for a lot of young leaders into eventually maybe planting like more traditional churches that are more missionally engaged in the future. And it started off as microchurches. But we have to have the willingness to risk. And I really do think that collaborative spaces like this gives us the courage to do that. So leave us with just some assessment questions. Everyone we collaborate is similar to us. We need to find a few other groups that are different from us to collaborate with. Some of us might feel like the second group, we're part of a diverse group of collaborators, but we need to contribute more meaningfully and regularly. And thirdly, some of us might be here where we collaborate well with our current circle of influence and would like to multiply and extend our collaboration. So just kind of thinking where you're at, I'm not saying that either one of these is the ideal, but you may be in a place where you realize that I got to get outside my bubble, or you might be at this place where you're like, it's go time, and we need to really create momentum with our level of collaboration. Dave, I'll send you all my slides, because there's a lot that, some practicalities and stuff like that. But anything that you want to press on before we transition out of this time?
I'm interested if anyone's had any light bulb moments, or this is my next step, either in your own church to think about development, or just what are the possibilities? Is the electricity off?
I was just going to say, I think this is the most frustrating thing for me being an outsider coming to Grand Rapids. The lack of collaboration. You have all these deep teams and tribal allegiances. That's been the hardest thing, to see collaboration across lines and stuff. I'm guilty of that, I'm sure, in a way, shape, or form. But yeah, it's one of those things where the electricity is off. But I'd love to see more of it. I've been in a ton of different conversations about collaboration from all these different groups that are trying to make it happen. But yeah, it's been hard to see.
And I do think sometimes you have to let the level of desperation rise a little bit more before you get there. I mean, I'm newer to Chicago, but I've heard it's been like a 20-year groan for people, and now we're seeing unprecedented levels of collaboration. But yeah.
That last slide, the pipeline with the this thing in my mind, there's some stuff we're thinking about, like just one is not enough. Diversifying just how many it can be.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, like this is getting off track with the schedule, but I think it would be a miss for us to talk about collaboration and not have time to say who we are, and we're doing that organically throughout, sort of what brings us here. I don't know if that's something later on. You can use like a 10-second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of collaboration, it is very important. To me, I find that this is the first group which we need to collaborate with that are different from us. And as Africans, we come here with a potential missionary impacts, and we want to do the job because we come from Africa. We came myself, I came as a refugee, escaping the persecution.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, I found myself that I was following my God's calling.
Yeah.
And I'm here and I'm doing the job. But the problem is that the way we plant churches here is different from the way we planted churches in Africa.
Yeah.
We don't have money. I was impressed by the statistics that we showed there, how we plant churches with minimum money, and we don't even have the amount that you mentioned there, but we do the job, but we don't have people to collaborate with, so that we can do the job. And it's very difficult. We have problems with the languages and the culture, and this is one of my major preaching. I mean, I used to approach people, telling them that you guys, you come in this country, it's a new country, it's a new culture, we have to mingle with them, find a way to integrate. If we don't integrate, we get nothing. It's already our land. We came here willing or not, we are here. And we have to work. We have no living. So I think the organization that are here could, I can recommend them to find collaboration with us. We are many here. And our churches are mostly tribal churches. Mine is a little bit unique, but different churches with one language. Enough in Congo, we have 400 languages and we have 400 dialects.
Yeah.
4 national languages, 400 dialects and 4 national languages and 1 official language.
Yeah.
I don't speak all of them, but I speak only 7.
Only 7.
And,
Only 7, yes.
So
Yeah.
if we can really, the organization that are here can take a step ahead and find us where we are and collaborate with us, help us to do the job with them.
Yeah.
Because we want to do the job, but we don't know how to do it.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. A couple of things before we wrap then. So trust and capacity. These are is a matrix that I use around collaboration. Trust represents relationship and capacity represents doing stuff together. And that really is, as we study church planting networks from Houston to Chicago to New York City, all these different city collaboratives. 15 years for making gospel saturation in a corner of a community. We're finding 5 to 10 years is what it takes to create like a long-term sustainable city collaborative. And that's a lot of false starts. The false starts are necessary because you have to be able to survive a couple of failures together to really know if you trust another group. And so, and then the capacity is you have to feel like you're actually seeing something emerge and develop. And so I would say in some ways, and the last thing that I think it would be practical for you all is in engaging in collaboration. It's hard to do collaboration around 12, 15, 20 people. But doing collaboration in triads, so 2s or 3s, 2 or 3 churches getting together, 2 or 3 church planters getting together from different tribes, different denominations. We're finding, at least in Chicago, this has actually been like, you think Jesus was kind of a genius when he says it just sticks 2 or 3 together in his name. And we're finding that we're developing micro networks in Chicago in units of 2 or 3. And so those are some of the practical pieces. I'll send you over the slides and you'll at least have.
And if anyone's interested, I can share.
Yeah.
Let's start some of those tribes. Let's start some of those networks.
Yeah. It's a great idea. It's just and relationally driven, 2 or 3 coming together. Yep. So hey, thanks for your time. I really appreciate learning from you all, and this has been rich for me. So thanks for having me. Yeah.